People who participate in close encounters of the fifth kind, or CE5, frequently report experiencing direct telepathic communication with unidentified aerial phenomena. Historically, conventional science dismisses these claims. The accounts are purely subjective, strictly anecdotal, and lack the objective data required for rigorous study. But researchers at the Windbridge Institute propose a different approach. Their thesis argues that these subjective field reports precisely mirror a phenomenon already heavily studied under controlled laboratory conditions in parapsychology. That phenomenon is known as somatic psi. It is an altered state of consciousness consistently identified and measured in certified mental mediums. The goal here is to construct an empirical framework for UAP telepathy. We can do this by mapping the subjective anecdotes of CE5 participants directly to objective, measurable neurophysiological markers. This relies on a core neurobiological principle. Every subjective mental state leaves a distinct, measurable electrocortical footprint in the brain. Validating the mechanism of CE5 telepathy does not require proving the existence of non-human intelligences. It only requires measuring human anomalous cognition. To measure anomalous cognition, we first establish the baseline waking state of the human brain. This standard mode of operation is almost entirely reliant on processing external sensory inputs. In this state, the brain maintains high volitional control, operates with a highly active default mode network to manage self-awareness, and runs predominantly on beta wave frequencies. This classification tree outlines the methodology used by Beischel in 2021. Utilizing the phenomenology of consciousness inventory, they measured departures from the waking baseline, isolating somatic pi, defined here as the non-sensory accessing of information from living targets. Mediumship studies map this state under highly controlled laboratory conditions. A CE5 encounter, by contrast, occurs in erratic, unpredictable field environments. Understanding the rigid laboratory parameters of somatic psi gives UAP researchers a standardized control. They can use this specific profile to measure and evaluate chaotic field events. The PCI identifies specific subjective traits of somatic psi. The first cluster involves an abrupt inward shift in attention, paired with a massive increase in the amount and vividness of mental imagery. Next is the entrance into a mild hypnoidal trance. Participants in this state consistently report a distorted, timeless sense of duration. But the most defining characteristic measured by the PCI is a sharp decrease in volitional control. Subjectively, this presents as a profound sense of passively receiving information rather than actively generating it through deliberate thought. The final trait is ego minimization, which is a severe reduction in self-awareness, often described by subjects as getting out of the way. In CE5 field reports, participants describe a sudden internal pull, vivid mental downloads, and a sense that information is being broadcast into their awareness, rather than being actively thought up. This subjective profile aligns with the core somatic psi traits identified in the laboratory. This raises an immediate scientific counterargument. How do researchers prove these individuals are receiving anomalous information, rather than simply engaging in hyperactive imagination? Qualitative psychometrics alone are insufficient to answer that. To verify the phenomenon, these subjective feelings must be corroborated by physical, anatomical changes in the brain. We can translate this psychological inventory into an objective neuroanatomical map. Hypnoidal trance carries a specific footprint. The brain shifts out of beta waves into dominant theta frequencies between 4 and 8 Hz, accompanied by high alpha activity. The sudden shift in attention correlates directly with the activation of the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. The ACC manages internal alpha rhythms, blocking external stimuli to focus entirely on internal states. The altered time sense physically manifests as a suppression of the prefrontal time-keeping mechanisms. Both reduced self-awareness and decreased volitional control map to a severe downregulation of the default mode network. Specifically, the suppression of the medial prefrontal cortex directly causes that subjective feeling of ego minimization, lowering motor readiness potentials. This specific neurobiological recipe is structurally distinct from the brain's standard resting state. It is also physiologically distinct from active fabrication, lying, or standard memory recollection. Somatic psi is a distinct, physically verifiable neurobiological state. To connect this physiology to actual telepathic performance, we look to an empirical proof of concept published by DeLoning and colleagues in 2013. The research team used electroencephalography, or EEG, to monitor electrocortical activity while subjects actively attempted anomalous communication. This scatter plot tracks the critical variable. It measures frontal theta power along the horizontal axis against the accuracy of information statements on the vertical axis. The finding was a direct positive correlation between frontal theta wave intensity and retrieved data accuracy. This correlation was most pronounced in the high-performing, certified mental mediums. The researchers also tracked variations in gamma band activity, noting differences separating active fabrication from actual mediumship. The researchers attached a scientific caveat to this. Gamma band data requires strict artifact control, as it is highly susceptible to interference from minor muscular movements. Since the intensity of this specific brain state dictates data transfer accuracy, CE5 researchers now know exactly which physiological marker to track in the field. With the theoretical neuroscience established, these findings can be translated into a practical, boots-on-the-ground methodology for UAP field researchers. Step 1 is phenomenological mapping. Field investigators must deploy structured tools like the PCI immediately following CE5 sessions to capture standard, quantifiable subjective data. Step 2 is physiological monitoring. Researchers need to employ field EEG and heart rate variability sensors during the protocols to track real-time shifts in theta and alpha waves, along with autonomic nervous system responses. Step 3 requires strict experimental controls. This means introducing rigorous blinding conditions where feasible, to ensure the retrieved information mathematically exceeds chance. Researchers must also structure their comparative analysis to distinguish between standard somatic psi reading, living human targets, and actual anomalous communication with hypothetical non-human intelligences. Finally, protocols must prioritize participant safety. Field operators must avoid inducing overly deep trance states in uncontrolled environments. Implementing these tools strips away the stigma surrounding subjective anecdotes. It allows anomalous encounters to be studied as hard data. The transition from anecdotal testimony to empirical evidence relies on the consistent application of these physiological and psychometric instruments.